Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm Holly Smith. I coordinate the business and policy programs here. Thanks for coming out on such a rainy evening. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan. He's the author of this book, Facing China, The Prospect for War and Peace. He's the Professor Emeritus of Hong Kong Baptist University. We are delighted to have him. He's going to give a presentation on his book. His book is also available for sale in the back if you're interested. And then he'll engage in a conversation with Ying, our ASHK Society Scholar-in-Residence and Professor of Hong Kong University. And then we'll take questions from the audience. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to ASHK Society, and as Holly said, under such climate, the heavy rain. So it's my great pleasure today to host this book talk. The book is available, and get a copy when supplies last. Limited copies, and Professor will sign the book after the talk. First, on the ground rules, the event is being videotaped. The recording will be posted on the internet. That means all conversations here are on the record. And about the author, he's a China expert, Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan. He wears many hats. He's a senior researcher emeritus at the French National Center for Scientific Research, Professor Emeritus at Hong Kong Baptist University, Senior Researcher at Asia Center, Paris. He's also the Associate Research Fellow at the French Center for Research on Contemporary China in Hong Kong, and on and on. And he teaches China's domestic and foreign policy at Hong Kong Baptist University. And in his spare time, he's finishing a biography of Deng Xiaoping, which is in French. I hope it will be translated into English soon. He spends his time between Hong Kong and France, typically from May to August. I would love to do that. I'm sure many of us would like to do that too. Now about the book. The book. Facing China was first published in French in 2021. The English edition that we're reading now was published in May last year. Professor Cabestan told me that he updated the new version, this one, in English, quite a bit, mainly because of the war in Ukraine. But his conclusions have not changed. So having read the book, I would agree that the framework and conclusions of the book have remained valid, and as we shall see in his presentation. And a lot of ink has been spent on the prospect of war in this part of the world. But I think the book is unique as the book is totally devoted to analysis, as the title says, the prospect for war and peace as we face China. And also the book is based on extensive research. The assertions are documented. It's a great reference because the citations and the references, I found it very, very useful. Actually, it's a guide to further reading for those who are initiated, and I think many of us do. So without much ado, Professor Cabestan, he'll do about 15 minutes presentation, and I will have a conversation with him, and then we'll open it to the floor for Q&A. So get your questions ready.
Thanks a lot, Ying, for this very generous introduction. Thank you to Holly and Alice and the ASHK Society for organizing this talk, making it possible despite the bad weather. Thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Now, what sort of triggered my book, the idea of this book, was this growing conversation on the risk of war between China and the US, of a war in which China would be involved. And of course, there is a book which is well known, published by Graham Allison in 2017, about asking the question whether China will fall into the Thucydides trap. Now, for the ones who don't know what the Thucydides trap is, it's explained very briefly on this. The idea is that that was between Sparta and Athens in the 5th century BC, but the basic idea is that the power transition between rising power and an established power has been very rarely peaceful in history. Now, I tend to, and I do that in the introduction of my book, to unpack and actually criticize this approach, because for two major reasons. The first one is we don't know whether we are witnessing a power transition today. China is rising, but the US is still the prevalent power in the world. So we may end up having a bipolar world, and that's what we're witnessing today, rather than a power transition. The decline of the United States is something which has been predicted many times, which has not yet occurred, in my view. And then the other reason is that actually we are in a nuclear era. And both China and the US are nuclear powers. And the irony is, as the previous Cold War has told us, that to have two nuclear powers facing each other and competing with each other, it's actually a factor of peace rather than a factor of war. Because nuclear powers have to think twice before starting a direct confrontation, a direct military confrontation. So for these two reasons, I tend to unpack, but also look at the issue of the growing competition between the US and China in different way. Now, that's the two covers. There's the first, you can see the French cover. And of course, things have happened, as Ying has said, in between the first and the second edition, the French and the English edition, the world has witnessed a new war, which is the war in Ukraine. But the war in Ukraine is quite different from any kind of confrontation between China and the US, because it's more a proxy war between the West and Russia than a war between two nuclear powers. And that's why this war has been possible. Now, actually, the conclusion of my book is rather optimistic compared to other books on the prospect of war between China and the US, in the sense that I tend to believe that in the foreseeable future, China and the US will continue to compete peacefully, and China will privilege what I call gray zone operation, tactics and operation. What is it? As you can see on this slide, the gray zone operation is a type of strategy which is aimed at pushing one country's envelope and in some areas in order to maximize its benefits without overtaking the threshold of war. So it carries risks, but there are major differences of nature between gray zone operations and a war and an open conflict. So, and I've looked at these gray zone operations in various parts of the areas surrounding China. Here is a list of the scenarios where, of these areas where scenarios of war have been discussed, are likely. The South China Sea, the Diaoyu-Senkaku dispute, the border war with India, and of course the Taiwan issue. Now, why people are more worried, and for reasons which are obvious, that we are witnessing an explosive cocktail of growing military capabilities on both sides, both China but also the US, but also on the Chinese side, growing nationalism as well. And here you've got a few data regarding the capabilities themselves. We can come back to that later. Well, one thing which has caught the attention of many observers is the fact that now the PLA Navy, the Chinese People's Liberation Navy, has more ships than the US Navy. It doesn't mean that it's more powerful, but it has created around China, in particular the Western Pacific, a new balance of power which the US cannot ignore, and the US and its allies, actually, by the way, including Japan, cannot ignore. Now, if we go through the various scenarios and the various areas where China has pushed its envelope and developed these gray zone tactics, I think the area where these gray zone tactics has been the most successful has been the South China Sea, where China, without starting open military operations, have managed to dominate the sea and put into a much more vulnerable and weaker position the other claimants of the South China Sea, be it Vietnam, be it Malaysia or the Philippines. I'm sure you're all following what's going on with the Philippines around the Second Thomas Shoal or Sabina Shoal. The tensions have flared up again not long ago. But clearly, both sides have remained under the threshold of war. What China has achieved actually in South China Sea in the last 10 or 12 years is, first of all, to build artificial islands in the Spratly area. You can see the Spratly, which is a very disputed part of the South China Sea, and to militarize them, and then to put additional pressure on the other claimants. And what happened in 2012 around Scarborough Shoal, which was de facto annexed by China, may happen again in other parts of the South China Sea, which is claimed by the Philippines. So without starting an open conflict with the Philippines, which is, by the way, a US ally. So there, I don't think that China needs to go to war with the other claimants. Actually, China would like to cultivate its relationship with ASEAN while keeping pressure on the other claimants of the South China Sea. So China's best strategy, I think, as far as South China Sea is concerned, remain the gray zone operations. And I think on that front, China has been rather successful to date. Now the other, so that's another map of the South China Sea. The other, and that's a picture of the well-known Sierra Madre, which is falling apart, which the Filipinos have been able to consolidate so far, and in order to assert its control of these so-called shoal. So now, if we move to another area where tensions also flared up in the last 10 or 12 years, which is the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, China has also dispatched its coast guards more often around not only in the contiguous water, but from time to time in the territorial waters around the Senkaku, in order to challenge Japan's sovereignty over the Senkaku. But there is a limit to what China can do. I think China has been able to assert its claim on the Senkaku Diaoyu, but without going as far as landing troops on the Senkaku and taking control of Senkaku. Because taking control of the Senkaku would trigger Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty, and would compel the United States to intervene together with Japan to regain control of the Senkaku, while the U.S. remains neutral as far as to which country the Senkaku belongs. The security treaty between China and Japan and the U.S. applies to the Senkaku as well, to all the territories administered by Japan. So that's less successful, although where China has been successful is to assert its claim and to remind everyone that the Diaoyu belongs to China. But it has, by the same token, also created more tension with Japan, which is not necessarily in China's interest. Now, that's a picture of. So that's a picture of the Senkaku Diaoyu, very small rocks, and actually, it sort of underscored while it's important, those islets are important from a symbolic point of view, they are not very important from an economic point of view or territorial point of view. Now, another area where China has pushed its envelope and there's been more tension in the last few years is on the Sino-Indian border. Tensions went to a peak in 2020, and for the first time in more than 30 years, there have been casualties on both sides. 20 Indian soldiers died in the Guadalajara Valley, on the western part of the disputed border, and at least Chinese soldiers. Now, since then, there's been the tension has decreased, and I think it's not in either side interest to start a war on the disputed border, or so-called line of actual control. I think there's been some disengagement of troops on both sides, and here again, there are many reasons for China and also for India not to start a war along the border. Not least because today India is part of the BRICS, and China wants to cultivate the BRICS, so that sort of limits also any kind of confrontation between China and India. Likewise, India has its own diplomacy, multi-alignment diplomacy, which also has convinced it not to go too far in this confrontation with China. And I would add to that the balance of power between the Indian army and the PLA is very much detrimental to the Indian side as we speak today. So I don't think that India would be inclined to start a war with China either. Now, of course, the biggest issue is Taiwan. And I may spend a bit more time on Taiwan, although I will try to be brief. One thing which has, to me, changed quite a bit the equation is China's and Xi Jinping's willingness to speed up unification. It looks like China is not happy with the status quo, which has lasted for quite a long time, that's for more than 70 years today between China and Taiwan. And of course, since the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, came back to power in 2016, pressure intensified. And Xi's election in 2024 has, of course, confirmed this growing tension between both sides. The reason is political, because the DPP, as you know, doesn't recognize the so-called 92 consensus. According to this one China with different interpretations. In Chinese, it's said, 一个中国一个表述. Now, the question is, whether the tension which have increased in the Strait will lead to a war between both sides. And again, my take here is that China has increased its pressure, its gesticulation, its military exercises around the island, has sort of intruded in what has been called, and you can see on the map, the ADIS, the Air Defense Identification Zone around Taiwan, but in most cases has remained outside of Taiwan's territorial water and airspace. All this flight intrusion, of course, today, if there is one thing which has happened in the Strait, is the fact that China doesn't recognize or doesn't respect anymore the medium line in the Strait, considering all the waters and airspace around Taiwan belongs to China, and so the PLA can fly and navigate its ships freely in those areas. But at the same time, the PLA Navy and Air Force knows well that if it goes into the airspace, and they will be challenged by the Taiwanese Air Force. They don't want to go that far. So in other words, my point is that China remains in the gray zone areas and has concentrated on gray zone operations, which objective is, and I mentioned here, is to, I think it's to intimidate Taiwan and to try to convince the Taiwanese elites, but also the Taiwanese society to not only to not declare independence, which is, in my view, rather unlikely, but to accept the 92 consensus sooner or later. Whether it's going to succeed, it's another story. I don't think so far it has succeeded. Now, these gray zone strategy is also coupled with another strategy which has not been abandoned by China, which is the United strategy aimed at winning over the elites of Taiwan, be the economic elites, political elites, or the younger generation of the islands. Now, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022, there's been even more, I would say, aggressive exercise conducted around the island, which, as you can see, we're very close to Taiwan's airspace and territorial waters. But again, I don't think they went as far penetrating in the 12-mile nautical mile limit around the island, or even around Penghu, which is around here, the Pescadores in English. So, and even if you look at the missile tests conducted in the summer 2022, again, some of them were flown over the island, but they splashed outside of the Taiwan territorial waters and airspace. So again, still part of what has been called the Great Operation. Now, some developments have been rather concerning lately, and it's in Chinese. Many of you can understand and read Chinese. It's around Tinmen Island. And here, because there was a fishing incident and there was a hot pursuit of illegal fishing by the Taiwanese Coast Guard in this area, that led to the Chinese side to be much more aggressive around the island and penetrate within the 12 nautical mile of this so-called restricted area around Tinmen. And it looks like it's a new contestation by the Chinese side of Taiwan, not only of Taiwan's jurisdiction over the waters around the island. And that's, I think, here China is pushing its envelope a bit further than before. How long it will last, we'll see. For the time being, there's been a number of intrusion in those waters, but so it's a new sign of additional pressure on an island which is, as you all know, very close to the Fujian coast and very close to Xiamen City. Now, I will finish with this question of Ukraine, which I was mentioned in the introduction, and which is very important because on both sides, I think there's been a number of, both sides and even on the American side, a number of conclusions or provisional conclusions drawn from this war in Ukraine. And I think for Taiwan, to put it simply, it's been a wake-up call in many ways that, wars happen and they can, happen very quickly. And it's easy to start a war, much harder to finish it. And we can see that with Ukraine every day. At the same time, there are many differences now between Taiwan and Ukraine. And I think on the Chinese side, I think which is observing very closely and very, very carefully the war in Ukraine, it has been, I think, a factor of caution. If I would like to summarize, the Chinese position on the Chinese conclusions drawn from the war in Ukraine on the Taiwan issue. Now, among the factors of peace, which are very quickly listed here, one, of course, is the fact that Taiwan is an island. It has been Taiwan's natural protection for 70 years now. The U.S. support of Taiwan is much stronger than the U.S. support for Ukraine. Biden said a fourth time at least he was elected in 2021 that the U.S. would intervene in case of an unprovoked attack of Taiwan by the Chinese side. The other thing which has sometimes been overlooked by observers, the fact that the PLA has not fought a war since 1979. It doesn't mean it won't be able to do that, but I think it's something to keep in mind. There is a kind of, on the outside security of Taiwan, I think the Taiwanese tend to be united. Just one example, the fact that the military service, the drafting system has been expanded from 4 months to 1 year has been pretty well accepted by most Taiwanese and by the political elite. So there is even some programs are contested, like the submarine program in Taiwan. There is a strong consensus for increasing defense spending on the Taiwanese side. Then you see the U.S. also strengthening its alliances in the Western Pacific with AUKUS, but also in particular with Japan. I will come back to the economic consequences in a minute. Now, on the negative side, of course, is as I said earlier, it's easy to start a war, and the power is pretty much concentrated in the hands of a few people in China. We can argue that Xi Jinping doesn't have as much as many personal powers and as Putin, but still, if there is a consensus in Beijing to start a war, I think, and Xi Jinping decides to do so, he can make it. Now, on the Taiwanese side, we know that the asymmetry between both powers is obvious, and on the Taiwanese side, I'm not sure that the Taiwanese armed forces are that well prepared to a war, and I think the will to fight among the society is something, according to opinion polls, is not that obvious. There are conflicting views on the island. Now, the most likely scenario, if there's a war, is not a landing on the island. That's a very complicated operation, which I don't think the PLA, for the time being, has the means to put together, but much more a blockade of the island. Now, there's been a lot of speculation since my book was published about, whether a sub-blockade could be imposed on Taiwan. So, meaning that China can still remain in the gray zone areas, but imposing some restrictions of Taiwan's economic trade exchange with the outside world. So that's something we can come back to in the discussion. Now, I will finalize. I will finish with the cost of war, which has been estimated by a number of think tanks. Not only the military costs and human costs will be huge in case of a direct war in which the U.S. would be implicated, but also the economic consequences of war on the Taiwan Strait will be, according to some think tank like the Rhodium think tank, incalculable, meaning that it will disrupt the supply lines of many products, including not only the semiconductors product, but also a lot of other high techs, and it will, I think, disorganize economic relations in the whole region and maybe in the world. So another factor of caution on all sides. So having said that, I don't think that there's any danger for Taiwan to declare independence. I think if there is a consensus on the Taiwanese side is to keep the current ROC constitutional order, which means that the status quo, in other words. Now, so I don't think that it's unification is likely in the foreseeable future. Now, let me just bring a few words of conclusion here. I think, again, the nuclear factor should be kept in mind. The fait accompli policy in the gray zone has been rather successful, except maybe in the Taiwan Strait. And the U.S. is in a different position than before, forcing its military to adopt a much more asymmetrical strategy than before. The danger, actually, despite all those factors, and the real danger is not the risk of wars, but more the risk of incidents that can degenerate in military crisis. And the problem for both sides and all sides, not only Taiwan and China, but also the US, will be to manage that crisis. The good news for China and the US is that military-to-military relations and contacts have resumed in the last few months. So in between the Indo-PACOM in Honolulu and the CMC, Central Military Commission in Beijing. But to what extent this is enough to prevent a war, a crisis from erupting, and to manage the crisis so that this crisis doesn't degenerate into a full-fledged war. That's the big question for the future. So that's why I think preemption and deterrence remain the best shields against any war in the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere around China. I stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Is this on? Hello? It's on, right? Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. Now, I have many questions. And maybe I will just start with the observation that, yes, the cost and the toll of war will be very high, right? But still, we keep hearing, and we keep, people still worry about the possibility of war. There's all these factors you have outlined. Now, but you also said that you are optimistic, right? Meaning that you don't expect a real full-fledged war. And as I read your book, it's also very interesting that in spite of this very ominous cover, the book has a lot of nuances. You went into nuances. You talk about internal debates inside China about whether if going to war, the Taiwan question. You also talk about China's withdrawal, retreated a bit on the wolf warrior diplomacy. You mentioned that. And so maybe you can elaborate a bit on your optimism given all this said, given your presentation, why you remain optimistic?
You know, a year ago, some Singaporean academics published a survey, opinion poll, conducted in China about whether the people in China would support a war with Taiwan. And everybody was surprised by the result. The result was not negative, but only, if I may say, only 52% of the Chinese who've been asked the question said, yes, we would support a war with Taiwan. So it means quite a number of people are against the idea of a war with Taiwan. So that's the first thing I would say. Now, even in the 1990s, I remember there was maybe it's a kind of cliche, but the southern, some people were saying in China, people north of the Yangtze River, Changjiang, they are in favor of the war. The southern are against the war. It's a kind of cliche because the southerners are more business people. They like to make money. They don't want to have a war because that's bad for business, and they and that's not what they want. So, and I think to some degree in China itself, these divides still exist. And within the elites, yes, you have got very different positions among experts about whether China should move beyond this gray zone strategy, which I have mentioned. And what I've been struck by, is that of course Xi Jinping is a more risk taker than his predecessors, more than Jiang Zemin, more than Hu Jintao, because the PLA is stronger, because China is stronger. But at the same time, I mean, the risks he has taken to date have been very calculated, there are some limits to where how far China is ready to go, and again, I think he has been very cautious to remain within the gray zone envelope.
So what you're saying is that in spite of the rhetoric, Xi Jinping is, in the main, is very rational, very cautious about the possibilities of sparking a major conflict.
Yeah, yes. It doesn't mean there's no passion. If you talk some people you ask, you talk to in China, some people are very passionate about unification with Taiwan, and they will be. You have some what we call warmongers. Whether they dominate, I have some doubts. And as you move towards to the upper level of the society and the leadership itself, they have to keep in mind many considerations. There is a theory according to which, when China faces difficulties, the Communist Party in China faces difficulty, there is more chance that he will be inclined to get embarked into international military adventure. Nothing in the political culture of the Communist Party would point to that. No, I think the political culture of the Communist Party is just pointing to the opposite. That when there are difficulties inside the country, China is not going to embark into a war, and we've seen that in the past.
Which is in a way the situation now.
Exactly,
the economy.
As the economy and the economy is going through difficulty. The growth rate is decreasing. I think. Well, Xi Jinping and leadership have a full plate of issues to sort out within China before starting a war with Taiwan or with the U.S.
But do you see the rhetoric inside China? Has it become more moderated, or because we know that the red line is a sovereignty issue?
Yes.
Right? And that is the bottom line that China will not accept, right? And then you have the election of Lai Ching-te and Taiwan. DPP has ratcheted up its rhetoric, right? And to the level of extent of being more provocative.
Less cautious maybe than his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, yes. Yes, now you mentioned the war for your diplomacy. There's been some ups and downs. The current trend is to sort of tone down the war for your diplomacy. But as far as Taiwan is concerned, I think the rhetoric has remained pretty much the same, pretty identical to what has been said. Sovereignty issue, Taiwan is part of China, and unification should happen sooner or later. Now, it doesn't mean that, I think it's part of it. It doesn't mean that China is going to go to war. It means it's part of this, what has been called a psychological warfare strategy, which is pretty much on the forefront in order to, first of all, intimidate the Taiwanese, change their mindset as much as possible, but also remind the whole world, China's claims and China's ambition. And in particular the U.S. So, and keep pressure on the U.S. to prevent, any closer relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan, which is already pretty close, actually. There's of course a growing dispute between China and the U.S. about what does a one China policy mean. And as you said, Ying has been less cautious. And the reasoning within the DPP, as you may know, is that Tsai Ing-wen was maybe very cautious, and this caution has not borne fruits. She has not been rewarded by China for being rather cautious, actually, as a DPP president. She couldn't go further than that. She couldn't endorse the 90 consensus because that would have antagonized her voters. And she mentioned she made a few. She mentioned a few things, and she made a few statements which would sort of alleviate those tensions or the concern on the Chinese side, which has not been the case of Lai Ching-te since he was elected in 24. If you look at his inauguration speech, he has been much more direct. He has referred to China as a PRC and saying that Taiwan is not part of the PRC, we're the ROC. So returning to some degree to 一边一国, 建设一边一边一国, which is each one state on each side of the Taiwan Strait, and that's of course China doesn't like this idea.
But then if you look at the other major factor, which is the United States, right? We'll see how the election will play out. It's anybody's guess. But for both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, both are running on a very tough China line. In her acceptance speech at the convention, Kamala said, quote, "As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world." It's not a declaration of war on China, but it is a no-nonsense declaration that America will keep its military supremacy globally, which includes Asia and our part of the world. And Donald Trump has also taken a very strong line, although it is a bit unpredictable. So how do you read the impact if either won the election?
Well, if Trump is elected, as a European, I will be more worried for Europe than for Asia and Taiwan, actually.
Makes sense.
Because, Trump is going to abandon Europe. In many ways, let the Europeans, sort out their problem with Russia and Ukraine, and reduce its commitment to Europe's security. Whether it's going to dismantle NATO, it's another story. I think whether he will ask and that's pretty clear to me, but maybe Kamala Harris may move in the same direction, actually, ask the European to pay more for their defense. Now, as far as Asia is concerned, what I'm worried about, you mentioned, yes, that Trump has been less predictable than the Biden administration, than Kamala Harris, and that's probably true. What I'm worried with Trump is the fact that he has, even on Taiwan, he has made a number of statements which indicate that he may be, tempted by a transactional kind of diplomacy. Say, yes, what does Taiwan bring to the U.S.? And he asked the question already. It may be rhetorical. It means that the Taiwan again needs to put more money and invest more money in its defense. And the U.S. Commitment is not that it's not a blank check, and it's maybe there's a cost to that. But that's. what I would say that those isolationist trends within the Republican parties exist, but they're going to be mitigated by other forces within the Republican Party, but also within the Congress. So it will be very hard for any president in Taiwan, in the U.S., to really abandon Taiwan. The idea of abandoning Taiwan is not in the books. Some American thinkers, experts are promoting that idea. Actually, we should put pressure on Taiwan to accept some kind of deal with China and to start with endorse an idea to consensus. But it's not something which either candidate to the presidency can envisage in the foreseeable future.
I'll just make one response and comment then, and open it to the floor. But isn't abandon China is an antique and antiquated concept?
Abandon Taiwan?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. Yeah, even for the U.S. to think that Taiwan is owned by the U.S. and it should not be abandoned. It's very
abandoned means stop supporting Taiwan and putting pressure to
right.
Yeah, but you see what you mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
But without the U.S., the Taiwan wouldn't survive. I mean, we have to be very blunt on that.
Yeah, but as you even my patriotic friends, so-called patriotic meaning pro-China, pro-Beijing friends in the United States, there's a sentiment that Trump's win will be better for Beijing because past events in the past few years, Biden has been shown to be more deliberate, more calculative in his policy towards mainland China. And it has continued the tariff policy, the sanctions against mainland, and is very deliberate in building alliances in the Asia-Pacific and all these alliances, China. And then, so they said, we'll vote for Trump, and who's more unpredictable, but we know that it will be more clumsy and less deliberate, and maybe it's better.
Okay, well, I will sort of react very briefly to that, saying two things. First of all, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States was initiated by Trump, by the Trump administration. And the second thing, I'm sure you heard of Mike Pompeo's pro-Taiwan stance. Former Secretary of State of the Trump administration is in favor of establishing diplomatic relations with Taiwan, so recognizing Taiwan as a nation state, so independent nation state. So I'm not saying that the Trump administration is going to follow Pompeo. I think he's kind of lonely voice in the Republican Party, but it tells you, how far some Republican can go as far as Taiwan is concerned. So they're still divided, and I think on China, first of all, it's not a major issue in a presidential campaign. I mean, domestic issues dominate, and the second thing is that there's a lot of bipartisan, kind of agreement on China, on tariffs, and on Taiwan as well, on security, on the alliances in the Western Pacific. So, okay, but what I would add to that is, even the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, have been rather cautious as far as the South China Sea is concerned. How far they will go in supporting the Philippines, in its claim of a Sabina shoal or other shoals, which have been contested by China. U.S. has been cautious. Both have been quite cautious.
So what it means, we're in a very precarious situation. Both sides are sending mixed signals, and a lot of it is international manifestations on their policy towards Taiwan and China, addressed to internal consumption as much as international consumption. So, questions? I know.
I see the microphone coming.
Michael there, and then the lady at the back. Yes. Mr. O'Neill.
Well, as Beijing increased the military pressure on Taiwan, so Taiwan buys more and more expensive, more high quality, larger quantity of U.S. weapons. So the United States is making billions of dollars out of Taiwan, and the more tension, the more money it's making. So how can Trump or Kamala use this argument? With Europe, they can use this argument that the countries don't spend enough on defense. But in the case of Taiwan, surely it's opposite. It's a wonderful market for U.S. weapons, and Taiwan cannot buy them from France or Germany or UK and West.
Yep. Okay, should I answer now?
Yeah, sure,
okay.
absolutely.
Yes, well, of course, you know, for Taiwan, there is only one weapon supplier, which is the U.S. I mean, other countries have been dissuaded from selling weapons to Taiwan for quite a long time, including my own country, as you know. What is important? Well, first of all, I would underscore the density of relations between the Pentagon and the Taiwanese military. On average, there are 3,000 to 4,000 Pentagon experts flying to Taiwan every year, or going to Taiwan every year. You know, they've just trained 85 tank, soldiers in the U.S. These relationship has deepened and intensified the last few years because threat is increasing. So it's not only weaponry but also training. And the big issue for the U.S. is to make sure that Taiwan can put together what has been called a conventional deterrence against Taiwan, against China. In other words, to make sure that the cost of war will be very high and maybe prohibitive for China. That any adventure against Taiwan will cost a lot to China, so that will force China to think twice before starting a war against Taiwan. So that's the idea. And the problem for the U.S. and for a number of experts, including in Taiwan, is that the Taiwanese armed forces are not necessarily well equipped to really put together that conventional deterrence. And so some additional work needs to be done. The submarine program is part of this deterrence. It's been controversial. I know that the KMT is partly against it. It's too costly. For the time being, there is one submarine which is going through some tests, so we don't know whether it's not yet operational. And it's a eight submarine program, which is very costly, but which is already has been approved by the DP. Whether the new parliament, the Lifa Yuan, the new legislative yuan, which is dominated by the KMT and the co-rangers party, are going to vote in favor of that budget, it remains to be seen. So there will be, I'm sure, a lot of negotiation and maybe horse trading discussions between both sides. But beyond that, I think the problem is how credible Taiwan's defense can be, and that's it goes beyond the cost of these defenders, all the weapons, fighters, ships, and other things bought from the U.S. Well, I would add to that Taiwan is its own weapons industry and has manufactured a lot of missiles itself, but also now more and more drones, because the war of tomorrow will be dominated by drones, drones, and we see that in Ukraine today, and that will be even more the case in the Taiwan Strait if the war breaks out.
May I quickly add that actually there's also a question about how serious is the U.S. quote commitment to Taiwan. Like it recently announced the sale of 228 million arms to military supplies to Taiwan, but it mainly consists of small trenches for replenishment and munitions, but it's not building trust or helping Taiwan's goal of building a modernized military. And so there's always questions about the seriousness of the commitment. And maybe the lady behind, and then we have many questions. Okay. Sure.
Thank you for your talk. I look forward to reading your book. I'm Kira. I'm a PhD student here in Hong Kong. I'm also an Australian, so I have to ask, what do you see as the role for middle powers like Australia in the region to facilitate peace between the US and China? And in particular, do you have opinions on the security groupings like the Quad or AUKUS?
Well, as a Frenchman, I have to be careful because, as you know, we had a crisis with Australia a few years ago because of the submarine deal, which was cancelled. And so Although we resumed talks and resumed contacts, and since then we actually the relationship has very much improved since Albanese became prime minister. So. Yes, I think Australia is part of the equation, and the Biden administration has brought Australia through AUKUS into as a U.S. ally, and it started with ANZUS, in the 50s. Actually, Australia has a limited range of options, and and I think the security community in Australia knows well that if there is a war in the Taiwan Strait, it will be hard for Australia not to get involved in it one way or another. How much it will get involved, we don't know. But it's a bit like Japan, Japan is so close to Taiwan, and the Okinawa is so close to Taiwan that it's hard for Japan not to get involved one way or another. And the question is the level of involvement, and what Australia can bring to the U.S. in case of a war. But I think it's sort of speculative, but because we're still in but from a political, because we're still in the state of peace, but from a political and even strategic point of view, I think it's the Australian support is also a way for the U.S. to strengthen its with the Quad and AUKUS, its alliances and make every ally on the same page, as far as Taiwan is concerned, which is, which also involve to some degree NATO and the EU, in the sense that we're all in favor of keeping the status quo and peace in the status quo in Taiwan Strait, and not doing things against the will of the Taiwanese, or the majority of the Taiwanese, which prefer to stay, as they are under the jurisdiction of the Republic of China.
Maybe we'll pick up, with this question. Maybe we'll pick up 2 or 3 and then we'll bundle them together. And the gentleman in, yes, okay, and then the gentleman in white before. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your generally, cautiously optimistic view. We don't always hear that. But may I ask how confident you are that in a time of crisis, policy will be decided in Beijing, particularly in Beijing, where it's concentrated at the top, entirely on a rational basis. In other words, that rhetoric will not trump rationality.
Okay. The gentleman in the white shirt in front, you have a question? No, and the lady? You asked a question. And this gentleman there? Just quickly. Thank you. Okay, rationality and...
in my point of view, I don't have a question, but I had a view that the military problem is not the main problem between Taiwan and China. And I think whether to beat Taiwan for China is just like the tool to control the ideology inside of the mainland China. So I think it's just a tool to control the people. So if the government just put out the military, say it collapses. So it's...
So you're saying that if the government initiated military action, it will collapse?
Yeah.
The people does not support it?
You mean from the survey, half of the people in China, they didn't support the...
Okay.
Less than half.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your comment. And you want to answer the question?
Okay, all right. First question about the yes.
Yes.
So, whether a military crisis can be managed, and both sides will stay away from, from a full-fledged military confrontation. In terms of military crisis, we don't have many precedents. There is one which we all know, which is the EP3 incident. You remember the EP3 of Hainan Island, between the U.S. spy plane and the Chinese fighter, and the U.S. spy plane had to, make an emergency landing in Hainan, and that triggered a big crisis between the two sides. Was it 2001? So more than 20 years ago. I think very quickly on both sides, the crisis was managed by the diplomats, not by the military, and that was a good sign, because it was Colin Powell who was the negotiator on the American side, so the crew was released after 2 weeks. The plane, it took half a year for the plane to be sent back to the U.S. But that's another story. So we have that precedent. We have channels of communication now, as I mentioned, between the CMC Central Military Commission and the U.S. the Pentagon and the Indo-PACOM. The risk is that, and that's a problem. Usually, when there is a crisis, instead of communicating, Beijing closes all the phone, and there is nowhere to reach the leadership. I mean that's and that's part of China's strategy to keep the U.S. side or the other side in doubt. About what the Chinese will do, and it's a black box in many ways. So we don't know how decisions are made. So that's what we can say about President military crisis. So. It depends on the intentions. The China may very well have the intention to trigger or to provoke a crisis in order to take benefit from it and narrow even more Taiwan international space or living space. But I don't, for the time being, I don't see it. So that's what I can say. I hope I have answered your question, because there's still a lot of unknown actually regarding the way the Chinese side is going to manage the crisis, depending on its intention. So we have to look at the intention of the full intention of the Chinese side. Now the risk of a military adventure which fails or which doesn't succeed. Of course, there are a lot of possible, likely political consequences for China. And for the Communist Party, whether that will sort of announce the end of the Communist Party. I mean, you have to be careful here. Communist Party is that's my own view on the stability of the regime, but there will be that is strong, and it has the means to control the society and to stay in power for quite a long time. So there may be some side effects and some more negative view of the party within society in case of failure, but to the point of threatening or jeopardizing the regime, I think it's far-fetched. So that I would say.
I think we can take maybe two more quickly. The gentleman at the back, and then here. Yeah. Yes, you raise your hands. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Briefly, yes.
Yeah,
please.
sure. So first, do you think we're seeing the start of World War III? Second part of the question is, what is a definitive sign of start of World War III effectively? Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman here in the suit.
Yes. I was thinking that perhaps we need some new perspective. Like China is, I think that if we look at what China trying to accomplish, it's really they want to have their own people have a better life, economic life, and they are not expansionary, and all their nuclear forces are really to defend themselves. They are not there to attack anybody. So the problem is all these. I think that a lot of press about the China is such aggressive country, and it is actually personally I think it's because of the military industry complex that the U.S. that actually it's better for them that you have all these tensions in the world, because then you need all these aircrafts, all these bombers, all these, which is actually not a very good optimal world that we to go for. So my main thing is that I think there's a recent article at the Foreign Affairs about not being so confrontational. I think if you look at the even economic basis of this kind of confrontational strategy, is actually really not optimal. So I think that if we could take more like strategically or how to look at China and the U.S. and how they can move towards peace and cooperation, co-conspiracy, prosperity, whatever, what you call. There's much in common among these people, among the two people. Then, I think that, all this other thing about this, of course, then you won't have any books to write about, this tension there. So personally, I think that there could be more discussion about how, to reevaluate what China is really about, and how the East and West can, work together. I mean, it's just really China is really different from Russia, I think, in that aspect. That and actually going back to the question about Taiwan, I think everybody can see that China will be able to take over Taiwan in the future because it's growing economic strength, and Taiwan is part of China. So it's no question about that the U.S. should be there to protect Taiwan first of all. So I mean, just if you look at just technically, militarily, that eventually China will be able to take over Taiwan.
Yes.
Nobody should doubt that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we got your point. We got your point, very important point. And then the question, the $1 million, $1 billion question, will there be World War III? But I think you've kind of answered the question.
Yes.
If you make one quick
very
comment.
yes. Would you like me to answer those two questions first?
Yes,
okay,
sure.
Okay. World War III. No, I don't think that World War III has started. I think I still think we can avoid it. And what has started is a new Cold War, which is quite different. It means we will remain at peace. There will be military crises, but there won't be any World War III for the reason I've indicated, and not. One of them is that China and the US are nuclear powers. And so, the risk of nuclearization, of a direct confrontation are there, which forces both sides to think twice before starting a war. So that's what I would say. But, the fact that we are in a new Cold War is that there is growing competition. And to answer the second question, is getting harder and harder to find common grounds between both countries. They can find common ground on some issues like climate change, and other issues, but on many issues, technology, ideological, disputes and issues, and geostrategic issues, it's very hard for them to agree. And the fact that the Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army, has become such a major force with a budget which is much higher than the Russian budget, which is of course smaller than the American budget, but which is catching up in many ways, is something which the US and its allies in the Western Pacific cannot ignore. So it has changed the equation. It has, and that's you say that yes, Taiwan is part of China, but it's not part of the same China, as you know. It's the Taiwanese see themselves being part of the ROC, and no one in Taiwan identifies with the PRC. So without any constraint, without annexation and a force of intimidation, it's very hard for the Taiwanese to accept to be part of the PRC. So the situation in Taiwan and Hong Kong are very different in many ways, So that's where we are. So even if I think, and that's to go back to this question of yes, it's not a military issue; it's more a political. It's very much a political issue between two ways of being Chinese in one way. One part of China is controlled by the Communist Party, so it's a one-party system. In Taiwan, it's a multi-party system which has different political values, and that's why I was tempted. You see in my slide, it's very hard to envisage a unification between North Korea and South Korea, which are two, both states claim to be part of Korea and to form in the future one nation. But again, this unification is impossible because they don't share the same values, and the same for Taiwan and mainland China. So that's where we are. I don't think we can change the equation. It's a political issue. So I don't think that any real unification can take place. Even because the one country two system formula would mean that for Taiwan to give up its statehood as and the Republic of China. So that's something which is not envisaged by Taiwan. Anyway.
Thank you. So just I think we're running out of time, and thank you very much for your question. We can continue this discussion. You'll be there signing books. And just to conclude quickly with a few words that the risks are there. We're fraught with risks in the region, but we can be cautiously optimistic for many factors that we've discussed. And let's keep it, hopefully, that we'll have peace, the prospect for war and peace. Then let's hope that peace will prevail. And thank you very much.